Chaps, July 16th, 1940 is the day in the Reichstag, or at least very close to it, Adolf Hitler declared effectively aim to invade and occupy Great Britain. You have to excuse me on my laptop. Operation Sealion, Directive number 16. Well, before we press on any further, it occurs to me that with all these dozens of idiot videos, you know, some people are probably clicking on these, seeing a title or tag involving, I don't know, Battle of Britain, Connell, Kampf, Dunkirk or whatever, and then it's just a bloke talking. But I was a tour guide on buses, admittedly, until lockdown started for the better part of a year. I did history, modern history at university 15 to 13 years ago, and I've always had an interest in it, and indeed specifically the Battle of Britain, for most of my life. And I took it upon myself, because no one else is bothered in my circle, such as it is, to do like day-to-day things on social media, sort of as if it's happening now kind of thing, as best as I can. I mean, I'm relying on websites at the moment. BattleBritain1940.com and the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command Memorial site, I believe, has the day-to-day. But then you've got things like Wikipedia that have like calendars, and it's not just Battle of Britain, of course. Today something else happened. Let's have a look. So just in case anyone sits in and thinks to themselves, my God, it's talking absolute rubbish, you probably will disagree. You might shake your head, you might laugh and chuckle at how I say things, but it's something for me to do. Maybe one day somebody will sort of look and go, let's have a look. There you go. Apparently on this day, the Japanese cabinet resigned. Vichy France revoked the French citizenship of naturalised Jews. Jews in the city of Colmar were pushed across the border into France. And Franco Spain broke off relations with Chile. There you go. Now you know. But Operation Sealion, as I've said before, excuse me, I'm awfully interested in Operation Sealion, but the fact it didn't happen from a youngish age, like my teenage years, I got interested in what I sort of think of as unique or never talked about, or not really massively hyped parts of history, like the fact there were British traitors, not solely British traitors, who were in partly the SS, but there were others probably. The British Freikorps, which of all the foreign volunteers of the SS was probably the most embarrassing in terms of the fact that of who it made up, what they did, how they acted. Whereas marked contrast, say the Dutch, Norwegian, Danish and even French parts of the SS. I mean, infamously now we know that the Charlemagne elements of the SS Charlemagne division were defending the Reich Chancellery in the Battle of Berlin in the last days of the Third Reich. And then there's things like the occupation of the Channel Islands, which we, people of course know about, but the Channel Islands are sort of outside our mind as far as Britain is concerned, I suppose, or British people, and little things like that. And Operation Sealion intrigues because it didn't happen. Obviously, if it happened, I would not be sat here doing these videos. I'll probably, well, you don't know. I mean, this is the great thing about what is. We don't know how. I mean, Fatherland is sort of seen as an optimistic version of the alternate history, in the sense that the Third Reich has managed to persevere into the 1960s, where some people would say the Third Reich could have fallen apart like a house of cards before that, because of how it was set up, and it was all sort of aimed to Hitler with no sort of contingency plan in place. And Harry Turtleduff's In the Presence of Mine Enemies has the Third Reich effectively paralleling Soviet Union in falling to bits in the late 1980s, 1990s, with various Germanised versions of people like Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev and so on and so forth. And so an invasion of Britain, as I learned when I was doing my dissertation, and I've still got like a dozen or so books scattered around the house, including an alternate history book that's written by a military historian called Invasion by Kenneth Maxey. I don't think he's with us anymore, but it treats the invasion of England as it was happening, and writes it like it's a military history, so it's fascinating. He theorises what if they invaded in July. And as I say, the directive was made now, July 16th. There were those, like Goering and others, who wanted to finish the job against Britain sharpish, in the sense that no sooner had the last British troops left Dunkirk around June 2nd, 1940, they wanted to make a landing as soon as possible and finish the job. And so Kenneth Maxey in particular, obviously, suggests that in July 1940 it could well have worked. But the thing is with this, you don't know how history would play out to the inch, so to speak. People will say, well, this, that and the other was bound to fail, there's no way this would have worked, that would have worked. I mean, for instance, the Luftwaffe at some point, or at least Hitler suddenly woke up to the idea, maybe we should physically attack the United States, and it was like, well, the Luftwaffe was not geared to that sort of operation. It barely managed to function in the Battle of Britain, in a manner of speaking. It didn't have the aircraft, and they were still doing it towards the end of the war. Well, was I? But, and also, how serious was Hitler? This was a man after who as late as July 1940 was probably still harbouring hopes that Britain would come to its senses, which was very unlikely considering all of the rhetoric Winston Churchill had been saying since he became Prime Minister in the middle of May. The fight him on the beaches speech, and one that he was on the radio the other day, July 14th, and if you forgive me for looking past you, part of the radio address was, "Be the ordeal sharp or long, or both, we shall seek no terms, we shall tolerate no parley, we may show mercy, we shall ask for none." So, the public image of Britain, in the shape of Winston Churchill chiefly, is that Britain is not rolling over anytime soon, and it's sure as hell not going to say to Hitler, you know what, you're right, we're knackered, we're exhausted, we haven't got the arms at the moment, or surrender at any point. Even when the Battle of Britain was at its worst, in the sense that Fire Command was starting to struggle, airfields were out of action, or pilots were thinning out, replacements were so green behind the ears, that had the Germans carried on instead of going after London on September the 7th, but then what would have happened? Even before the directive on July 16th, the Germans are making measures to get ready for invading Britain, and their main craft are barges, or what they called prams, basically pram with a H in it. And these were scoured from all over Germany chiefly, but I'd imagine also from the likes of Holland as well, because of the canals. And the majority of them would have to be towed over. The maximum speed wouldn't be that much, and they'd be full of troops who were obviously a little bit green behind the ears. Germany's only got one coastline, and it's never really been renowned for its navy until then. And a passing barrel wave of a Royal Navy ship could swamp and indeed sink these barges. Germany at that point had very few, if any, purpose-built landing craft like what you'd see on D-Day, or in Sicily, North Africa and so on. Invading Britain was partially considered before the war, and there were photographs taken of things like Tower Bridge and Buckingham Palace, like it was for a tourist brochure, and there was half-hearted preparations. But again, Hitler was didn't really go into World War II thinking at some point he would have to invade Britain, and in a way, invading Britain should have been a priority. If not in the summer of 1940, then the spring of 1941. Like I say, it's conjecture, but I would have imagined that he's done a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and by all accounts, all the way up until June 21st, 1941, Stalin's sure as hell not thinking of doing something to Germany, not yet, at any point. He seems quite okay with the status quo. There's a book, I think it's Roger Morehouse, called The Devil's Alliance, which is about the alliance from the non-aggression pact, all the way up to Barbarossa's commencement. And there were still things being shipped, like there was a train full of fuel or something, leaving Russia for Germany the day they invaded. That new battle cruiser whose name escapes me, that was half built and was sent over to Russia for their use, when Germany invaded in 1941, Stalin was utterly shocked, like somebody has kicked him in the balls or something, and he disappeared for a couple of days to his darker. So he used to say that if Germany didn't invade Britain in 1940, that they could have redirected, gone back to bombing the airfields and the cities maybe, and softening up places like Dover, Portsmouth or whatever. And then come the spring of 1941, when the Reverend tide is right, and when they've built up a little bit more material, they invade Britain, make the best of occupation, either invade still in May of 1941 or possibly postpone the invasion for a year somehow and invade in 42. You don't know, of course. And honestly, I don't think Germany would have had the, would have been able to do both in the same year, despite that suggestion. And had they invaded, say, in September 1940 and managed to defeat Britain within a month or so, which could have been entirely feasible, because once they were ashore, I don't think the German army necessarily would have had problems. It depends on various things. They would have probably still infected. There would have been no Britain to interfere in Greece, because the invasion, Britain going into Greece in 1941 delayed Barbarossa by a month because Germany diverted, and they ground to a halt before Moscow, October, November 41, when the winter started to take hold, and then lost ground because the Russians counter-attacked ferociously, and then in 42 they made immense ground again. So that month could have been quite integral. They could have taken Moscow, probably. So it's all up in the air. But as far as Sealion is concerned, the High Command, the Wehrmacht, throw themselves into it as best as they can. Some more seriously than others. I think Rada was suggested treating the invasion like a grand river crossing, which Germany had done quite successfully in France and Belgium and probably Poland. I never really remembered reading anything about it, but the River Meuse and so forth, the Seine. They did a little bit in Norway, but Norway wasn't entirely a pristine operation as far as the Germans were concerned. And initially it was meant to be this broad front from sort of around Portsmouth all the way past Dover up towards somewhere like Canterbury, and it got shrank, and a shrunk bridgehead is similar to the one on D-Day in a way. So could Germany have invaded in July 1940? Possibly. They did gather material in a rather short time in July 40, but you'd need air superiority, and you have to deal with the Royal Air Navy. And Kenneth Maxey theorises that the Luftwaffe could have bombed Scapa Flow from their bases in Norway and done damage there, and bombing Portsmouth and the other bases. Because back then we had more than Portsmouth in the south of England. We've got Plymouth, but it's mostly a submarine base now. And there's minefields that the Germans are laid and the British are laid, and there's U-boats operating in the North Sea and Channel who are helping out. And if they only had to push the Fire Command to a certain point, like I said, they were very close to a collapse of sorts when the Blitz started. Essentially, Sealion would be reliant on incredible amount of good luck. The chief concern is getting ashore. Like I said, the German army itself in 1940 was still at the top of its game. It still was even in the invasion of Russia. Afterwards, the once great Wehrmacht was shattered, really. A lot of men were lost in Russia. And certainly the army, when it surrendered in 45, was not really the same army of 1940-41. So, let's say they managed to get ashore, they have taken Dover relatively intact, or a harbour like Folkestone or Felixstowe, and they start bringing arms ashore, and then, there's a couple of Luftwaffe airfields which enable stuff to be brought in, but also the Luftwaffe to carry out offensive operations now, wider and deeper into Britain. Once they were ashore, I think the German army might have been reasonably okay, but then of course there's other alternate histories like Operation Sealion by Richard Cox and C.S. Forster's I think it's called When Hitler Came, which was published posthumously, and books like Invasion Scare 1940 that say, if Germany had come ashore, they would have been kicked out. It really does depend, I think, when they invaded and the conditions of the invasion. July 1940 to August 1940, they probably would have had things their own way once ashore. And also Churchill was considering that if Britain went under, then the Empire would go off to Canada and India and all the rest of it. So they would still have the Empire. And I can't see the Empire following Britain into subjugation, not all of it. But either way, all of that is immaterial, as Hitler says, essentially an invasion and, if necessary, occupation of Britain. Would it have been a complete occupation from Land's End to John O'Groats? It's debatable. For an invasion that was possibly not taken seriously or not, Germany did make an incredible amount of effort and preparation for what they would have done afterwards, like France 6 and going in with his Einsatzgruppen, based in places like London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, and rounding up and deporting the Jews, if not possibly setting up, I would have thought, a concentration camp somewhere in Britain, creating a ghetto in London. They theorised Stepney maybe, or I guess Golders Green. It sounds pithy, but you don't know, do you? No, I can't imagine anyone thought in 1939 Hitler would set up a ghetto in Warsaw. Either way, they would have been earmarked for death. Even though things like the gas chambers only came along in 1942 as a method of execution, they would undoubtedly have been, all the 400,000 odd Jews in Britain would have been deported to the mainland and head east. But this is the thing, I read in it's either Lawrence Rees's book about the Holocaust or David Serrani's, probably one of the two, definitely, that the intention initially, when the war started, or at least got going, was that they would defeat Russia and ship the Jews out east to Siberia and keep them there. So, keep them out east. I don't think extermination was necessarily on Hitler's mind at that point. He definitely didn't like them, didn't want them anywhere in Germany. From what I've read so far, I'm reading Peter Longwick's book about Hitler, so we'll see if that says anything different. But Hitler didn't sort of go into the war, I don't think, with the mind of exterminating the Jews, merely removing them from Germany. So they could have gone to Siberia, say, in the winter of 1941, had Hitler defeated Russia, or at least taken Moscow. But the longer that the invasion of Russia went on, there was other considerations, and probably even before the invasion of Russia, because one idea was Madagascar, which was French at the time, and Madagascar is off the southeastern part of Africa, of course, and the whole island was essentially going to become a ghetto, I suppose, and they would have been treated like shit, probably worked to death or just left to their own devices. There's a book called The Madagascar Plan, which is the second in an alternate history trilogy, if Germany had won the war, and indeed most of Africa went under the Nazi heel, like there would have been a transcontinental autobahn, for instance. And the Madagascar map, I assume, is based on some degree of reality, would have a navy base and so on and so forth there, and possibly gas chambers once the Holocaust has died. But that idea was up a creek without a paddle. It's all and dandy shipping them to Madagascar, but the trouble is the Royal Navy is still a potent presence with Britain still going, and even after, say, they had occupied Britain, the Royal Navy would have still been operating out of Cape Colony, I think it was still known in the war, Alexandria, Hong Kong, Singapore. Either way, it wouldn't have been an easy journey, and it would have been a costly journey to the Germans, losing ships they would have needed. So Madagascar was kind of scrubbed. And then, of course, the Holocaust got going. The Holocaust did start, of course, with the invasion of Poland, people being machine gunned and walked into woods. But the Holocaust, as everyone seems to know it as industrialised murder, started around late 41, 42, especially once the Fonzie Conference. And the Fonzie Conference even, and what was it, 43, 42, they had made a note, Heydrich and the RSHA and all the others, of all the Jews in Europe, and they included the Irish Jews and British Jews. So I don't know what the German thinking was at Fonzie. They were, of course, assuming they would still win the war. Come 45, say they've won the war. Would they have demanded Ireland and Britain hand over their Jews? So it would have been grim, but had well, if they had set up a place in Siberia for them, it wouldn't have been pleasant, but they'd be alive. But it is conjecture, of course, and I can't remember what Lawrence Risa David Swanee said about it, but I read somewhere once that Roosevelt was suggesting Ethiopia as a homeland. Somebody was suggesting Alaska. You wouldn't have the trouble in the Middle East we do now. It'd be in Africa, probably. So that's sort of like, you might say, a sidebar. And it obviously never happened. There's some people who reckon that there was a cover-up during the war when there was some sort of test of this oil on the water, and you'd set fire to it with either a flamethrower or a grenade, and it was meant to be a last-ditch effort really to stop Germans invading. Say the invasion happened, they would set fire to the water, and supposedly dead bodies rolled up on our shore. But it seems the likelihood is that the Germans were doing what they had been doing since almost after Dunkirk, and practicing for invasion, and landing, and something had gone wrong. There'd been an explosion or something, and the English Channel being the English Channel, the bodies washed up here as well as France. Just like when HMS Charybdis, I can never say that, was sunk not far from the Channel Islands, and all the major islands had hundreds of bodies washing up because of the way the currents work around there. And as I say, historically, the only part of the British Isles, or the British territories, occupied were the Channel Islands. And the occupation, though not entirely good for people, because, you know, by the winter of 44, 45, they were starving. Famine conditions, really. And all the horrible slave labour going on Alderney and the other islands, because Hitler wanted them part of the Atlantic rule, but Alderney is meant to have had a concentration camp on it, and possibly the only instance of the SS on the islands. It's not an accurate basis of what could have happened here. Britain's a much, much, much larger country. Major cities, major towns. Things like resistance would have been different, the occupation would have been different, and so on and so forth. And indeed, Britain was preparing for invasion before Dunkirk, and things like the auxiliary units were coming into focus by now. And as I say, you know, you can't talk about something that A never happened and B would have been 80 years ago had it happened. However, you have to hope that, say the RAF had been broken, say the Royal Navy had been pummeled enough and the Germans were coming ashore and they were in the prime of their game, you know, the same army who's rolled up Poland in a matter of weeks, France in a matter of weeks, Norway in a couple of months, whose Luftwaffe seemed invincible, that British people, not just the army, would have done everything that they saw fit. Not every single person would have resisted. I mean, the population was being urged, if it happened, to stay out of the way, stay in their homes, lock themselves in a cell or something, in case, you know, there's retribution or something. But like Norman Longmate writes, and if Britain had fallen in his the theoretical chapter where they've come ashore, there would have been isolated pockets of resistance. Even the Home Guard would have been a bloody nuisance. Not for long, they would have been a nuisance. And the only one of the outlooks is that of liberation. You know, you invariably do go to, well, what would have happened? Well, as I've said before, I can't see Britain being liberated by the United States unless Churchill is alive and is a constant nuisance. you know, say he's in Canada and he's constantly on the phone, or he's sending messages, or he's visiting Roosevelt saying, look, we might have gone under, but you need to liberate Britain to take on Hitler, and then you can go after Japan. Or whatever. Churchill would have phrased it a lot better and more intelligently. So yeah, today's the day. S-Day is set tentatively for somewhere in September. Tides and everything are important. And today the Battle of Britain has been a little bit quiet. 1 British aircraft lost with 1 pilot, 4 German aircraft to 4 pilots, or 4 air crew. Probably fighters if it's 4 aircraft, but either way, they've attacked Leon Solent, which is just round the corner from Portsmouth Harbour. Losses are light for what will come later. Hitler's biding his time. So that's July the 16th, 1940.